Hello, mic check. We'll get going here in just about a minute or two. I think they're just, oh, no, I guess we'll get going now. Let's do it.
All right, welcome everybody. This is an ace in the hole, stealthy host persistence via securities descriptors. My name is Lee Christensen, Tifkin on Twitter. I work at Spectre Ops, where I'm a researcher. I do defense. I do red teaming. I'm just kind of like a catch-all guy there. I also do a lot of coding.
Yep. So I'm Matt Nelson. I go by Enigma0x3 on Twitter. I also code a lot. I think most of us do. So.
Yeah. I'm Will Schrader. I'm Harmjoy. I participate in a bunch of projects: Empire, PowerView, PowerUp, Bloodhound, all that kind of stuff, and got to do some really cool stuff with these guys that we're really excited about. So, overview of this presentation. We have a ton of content. We didn't know what to cut, so we're going to have a fire hose of security descriptor stuff for you guys. So, we're going to go over kind of offensive approach of using host-based security descriptors for persistence. A little bit of intro on securable objects. We might go a little quick through that section. We're going to talk about the research process that we took to actually find these types of things, how we enumerated and weaponized these components. A little bit of information on takeover primitives for host-based security descriptors. Six or seven? Do we have 7 case studies or something like that? Yeah, about 6 or 7 different case studies, a bunch of really cool stuff. That's the meat of the presentation. We're gonna kind of jump through some of this other stuff so we can get to the really cool material. And if we have time at the end, we'll go over a bit of defense. So, I talked with Andy and Rohan earlier today at 1 o'clock about Active Directory security descriptor abuse. I talked with Andy at Black Hat and Decom of an Active Directory approach for persistence. This is the host-based version of that approach. So, offensive implications. Why should you care about what the heck we're talking about? So, this is Matt Graber's disembodied floating head. He's right there at the front. He had one of my favorite quotes ever at Black Hat 2015, which was, as an offensive researcher, if you can dream it, someone has likely already done it. And that someone usually isn't the kind of person that will come and speak at security cons. By Matt effing Graber. I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. So, really here, the mentality being that, as independent researchers in the commercial space, we come up with these cool ideas, we just realize someone's probably already done this. 1, it keeps us grounded, and 2, it makes us a little terrified as far as defense goes. For example, Matt started looking at some WinRM, right, backdooring, and he's researching. He wanted to find a way to backdoor WinRM that non-administrative users could pop it, and he came across this. If you want to...
Yeah, so obviously I had WinRM and WinRS. I was looking, are there any other public sources for backdooring this component? I found this back in 2014.
It was literally exactly what he wanted to build.
So somebody is setting the decals for PowerShell and WinRM so that a specified user can remotely use it without being, having any other additional privileges. So 2014, that's 3 years ago. So somebody was thinking along the same lines as us right now 3 years ago, which is a little frightening to me.
And published the code.
Yep.
So, again, Andy and I touched on this during the Active Directory talk earlier this year. This is just abuse of the access control model for these different securable objects. So would really, really, really surprise us if advanced adversaries were not using these approaches for persistence mechanisms in domains.
Likewise, a lot of these are used legitimately as well, so that may have very well been a legitimate use case, but it's very also likely that it could have been used for malicious purposes.
So that touches on this exact point of one of the coolest things about this persistence approach is that it's very, very difficult to determine if a specific misconfiguration you find was set maliciously or configured by accident. So it could have been a third-party piece of software on the AD or host-based side. It could have been, some kind of misconfiguration debt that Andy, Rohan and I talked about earlier. So even if you can find these misconfigurations, how can you tell that they were actually maliciously put there? Because of the forensic footprint they have, they can sometimes survive OS upgrades, domain functional level upgrades, and it's very difficult to actually triage these types of things because people are not used to actually viewing security descriptors as a method for persistence. So this gives us bug longevity. This gives us prevest potentially in some situations, and persistence. Again, what terrifies us is these may have already been on your system. So hopefully when we show you the scenarios, you guys will be a little scared by the end. A couple other big points. Just like I mentioned, most defenders are not aware of this general persistence approach. So they aren't even looking for this stuff. There haven't really been that many tools that allow you to look for this stuff. And with this approach of the different classes we're going to talk about, you don't have to leave malicious code on a system in order to regain access. And you don't have to add a user to the local administrators to regain access. There are a million different ways you can approach the same problem. Also, another scenario that was brought up to me when I was going back and forth with some people thinking about this stuff. What if an adversary gain control of the gold image provisioning process for an organization, and they could push out persistence on the gold image and regain super subtle access to every single machine in the entire enterprise without defenders even knowing about it? Also, some people have talked about certain scenarios that have touched on some of the stuff we're going to talk about, specifically like the service control manager, which is the canonical example. Many times you're talking CCDC and different things. People say, allow everyone access to the service control manager or different other components. One of the really cool things that I think you can approach, or you can take with this approach, is you don't need to add the everyone principle as the trustee, who has the rights. You don't have to have this S110 everyone or authenticated users. If you want to use this operationally and responsibly, the security descriptor backdoors can be set for specific trustees. So like one specific domain user actually has this ability to regain access. So you can minimize the exposure to an environment, because from an OPSEC consideration, we don't want to introduce additional vulnerability to the environment we're assessing. Also, this kind of touches on a little bit of different things that Graber talked about in his keynote. So some people are going to say, well, if the attacker has code execution on your system, you're screwed, so who cares? Or you already have to have admin rights to do this. This is stupid. Who really gives a crap? To this we say, domain joined systems are not the same as isolated home systems. These components can be installed remotely before lateral movement. So sure, you have a chicken and the egg problem for the initial code execution system, but if an attacker ever gained access on your box, they can set these components to regain access later on. Or if you're in a domain scenario, even if your security is perfect, if domain administrator credentials are compromised at some point, your box might be popped. So the enterprise scenario is very, very different than just that single fish scenario. And, well, I guess if that's true, the entire defensive industry should just like pack up and go home, right? Because, well, no, they had codecs in your system, so therefore all this kind of stuff is stupid and we should just throw up our hands and leave. So we believe that this stuff actually matters, and we're going to try to convince you why.
So a little bit of an introduction to securable objects for those who are unfamiliar with them. So what is a securable object? A securable object is any Windows object that can have a security descriptor. So when we're talking about these objects, what does that actually mean? Well, there's a lot of objects in Windows. There's built-in NT objects that most people are probably familiar with, like processes, files, tokens. All those things have security descriptors, but there's some lesser-known things that also have security descriptors, such as like RPC servers, print servers, and several other objects. So since securable objects have a security descriptor, let's take a look at what a security descriptor is. All a security descriptor is it's a structure in Windows that has a bunch of different fields. In particular, we're interested in 3 different fields that this security descriptor has. It's who owns the object, the SACL, and the DACL. So the owner of an object has complete control over the object. So if you own a file, you can do anything to the file. The SACL defines some auditing rights. It's mainly used for blue team and defensive stuff. And then the DACL is the discretionary access control list and specifies the actual rights individual people have. So it's a list of what we call ACEs, access control entries, that specify which users or which groups can do what things to that object. So can you read this file, or can you write to this file, etc. So this is how most people are familiar with seeing it on Windows. If you right-click on a file, for example, this is a folder. You can see up there at the top, there's the IT admin is the owner. He can do anything to that object he would like. The decal is under the permission entries section. That's a list of ACEs, and the ACEs specify what those specific principals can do, those trustees can do. So in this picture, the marketer, for example, has an ACE that allows reading and executing in that folder. So where are security descriptors found? They're found all over the place. It really depends on the type of object. You can find them in the registry. They may be in a configuration file on disk, in the kernel, in memory in the kernel. With Active Directory, they're stored offline in the ntds.dip file. So it just really depends on the type of object you're analyzing, and finding what objects are securable and where those security descriptors come from isn't exactly an easy task. You may know, it depends on the object once again, but depending on the object type, it's not exactly trivial to determine where that security descriptor comes from. So we talked a little bit about decals. Decals just define what users can do what to the object. So this is an ACL. All an ACL is a list of entries, access control entries. So they control access to an object, whereas SACLs, they are another type of ACL. They control auditing of that object. So you can create ACEs in a SACL that will create alerts for whenever that object is accessed. So for example, as a defender, you may want to create an ACE on a registry key that alerts whenever a user writes to a registry key. Think of like a run key. You could alert each time the run key value is modified, and that'll get shoved into your event log, which you can then alert on in your SIM. So decals and SACLs are both very useful from offensive and a defensive perspective. For restricting access and alerting on malicious access to objects. So when we're talking about these different rights, so I mentioned before that each object has different rights. So you may think of like a file, you may have read access, or you may have write access to the object. Well, there's different types of objects that don't necessarily have those same rights. So when we're talking about standard rights, those are specific rights that apply to all objects regardless of their type. So it could be a service, it could be a file, it could be an Active Directory object. That specific right applies to all of the objects. Whereas there's also object-specific rights, such as, a service isn't going to have the same permissions or the same rights as a file. So for services, for example, there's a create service right or a start service right, whereas a file might have file read or file delete. Decals are kind of a tricky thing. There's a few little caveats when you're talking about them. A security descriptor, that structure that Securable Objects has, they can either have a null decal or they can have an empty decal or no decal. But those two things aren't equivalent. If you have a null decal, that grants everybody access to the object. Whereas if you have no decal, or if it's just empty, that just means nobody can access the object besides the owner. We're not going to dive into inheritance in this talk. That can get really hairy, and it's also very dependent on the type of object you're working with. And when you're talking about how the ACEs in a decal are evaluated, that can also vary depending on the settings and the type of object. In general, they're evaluated in this order here: explicit deny, explicit allow, inherited deny, and inherited allow. So we're not going to dive into those specifics or corner cases there, but just know that there might be some variances.
And one kind of cool thing with that, the interpretation of the different decals, the explicit allow, and those kind of components with inheritance, is you can potentially do really interesting things for anti-audit measures, like what Andy and I talked about at Black Hat this here, in that if you add an explicit deny for any admin to deny the ability to even read the ACL information, there's ways that you can hide these backdoors from admins.
So a little bit about the research methodology we took when examining all these host-based security descriptors. We kind of took, it was a 4-step approach. Our numbering got kind of screwed up there. So in our research approach, we're focusing just on accessing objects from user mode with the context of we want to use these for persistence or lateral movement. So when we're saying we're using security descriptors for persistence, we're changing security descriptors so that we can regain access to this host on a network. Usually this means that we already have access somewhere else in the network already, and then we're regaining access to a machine we may have lost access to previously. So when we went about trying to decide what objects we should look at, we kind of took this approach here. So first it was discover, what securable objects are there, and then analyze and then figure out how to enumerate the security descriptor for each of those objects. So whether it's offline or online, which we'll dive into a little bit, we'll figure out how to pull that security descriptor. And then we need to identify what rights each of those objects have. So the access mask on on each ACE. So what rights are specific to each object, and which of those rights can we use for persistence or lateral movement. And then as a follow-on to that, creating some code to weaponize that stuff operationally and for offense and for defense. So the first step, discovering securable objects, there's a few different approaches that we took. When you first kind of start diving into securable objects, if you do just a quick Google search, you'll come up on MSDN where they list anywhere from like 20 to 30 objects. That's not quite the case. We've identified over 70, and that list just keeps growing the more and more we dig into it. There's so many different object types. There's so many different RPC servers, Decom servers, so many different applications that use security descriptors that it's just, this list is going to keep growing. And another good source that we use to identify different object types is the Microsoft protocol specifications. So that defines all the different protocols Windows uses, and to secure those protocols, Windows uses security descriptors to lock down access to them. So different protocols are like the Service Control Manager, Remote Registry, and those are just a few examples. Another thing that we did was I wrote a little script called Find Registry Security Descriptors, and all that did was enumerate every single value in the registry and tried to convert it to a security descriptor. Usually in the registry, those are stored as either a byte array or a SDDL, which is a string version of a security descriptor. And so I ran that throughout the entire registry, and it's really interesting when you do that to see how many security descriptors are stored there and how many I personally didn't have a clue what they did. So it's exciting in terms of research because you can dig into what those are actually used for and whether or not you can use them. So this is just an example of some of those security descriptors I found there, but I found thousands and thousands when I ran it. So once we've discovered these different types of securable objects, we need to enumerate the security descriptor on them. When we do that, I like to break it out and think of it in terms of the offline object and the online object. So offline is when the security descriptor hasn't been started up and the security descriptor itself is stored offline somewhere, such as like in the registry. And then when the application starts or a service starts, it reads that offline security descriptor and applies it to the application. At that point, the application is online. And as an attacker, you could also modify the online security descriptor. So if I compromise a host, if I want that security descriptor tampering to persist across reboots, I want to modify it offline. That way, when it reboots up next time, it's going to read that same configuration. Whereas if I want to be maybe a little more stealthy, I could just go into the host and just change the security descriptor in memory rather than the offline version. And then that'll only persist as long as the machine is online. Once it reboots, it will no longer be there. So we want to enumerate both cases, and so that's and from both a privileged and an unprivileged perspective. So what are some of the existing tools for this? There's Access Check from sysinternals, which most people are probably aware of. There's also a really interesting project from NCC Group, I believe it was, called the Windows DACL project. Google's Sandbox Analysis Tools by James Forshaw. There's a really great commandlet in there called AntiAudit Measures, and I absolutely love that. When I first started enumerating the different objects for this talk, I was doing it manually, and then I came across his tool and realized I'd wasted like a week of my time. I was like, I'm just going to let James Forshaw do it. He's going to do much better than I ever could. And then Bloodhound can also be used specifically for Active Directory objects. Most of these tools don't distinguish between offline security descriptors and online. So that is one of the caveats there. And something to keep in mind is if you're using those tools, how do you know if it's been modified or if the security descriptor has been modified before or after the application has been started? Some of the caveats, so like I mentioned, online versus offline security descriptors. In order to read security descriptors, you may need certain privileges. You can restrict access to a security descriptor depending on one of the access rights. Some objects you also can't see from user mode. The kernel has what's called private namespaces. So if you're a user mode process, you won't be able to view those objects it's created. For example, a section object that's created in the kernel and then shared to a process. You may not be able to enumerate that. And also, if the object doesn't have a name, you can have named objects and anonymous objects. Some objects, if they don't have a name, you can apply a security descriptor to them, but that security descriptor doesn't actually mean anything. Windows just ignores the security descriptor when you try and access the object. So just another caveat when you're enumerating these different security descriptors.
All right. It completely makes sense to everybody, right? All this, everyone knows, just like earlier this morning, everyone knows exactly about security descriptors now. So we're going to be publishing more and more research in the next couple of months on this to try to clarify everything. It's a very, very dense topic. You know, we wanted to give the background to everybody, but now we want to try to show, all right, here's all this stuff. Maybe some people are like, oh, this is boring, but we want to show you the really cool offensive stuff you can do with it. But the last caveat is when you have this access mask that actually determines, you know, what these rights mean per object. Determining what the access mask means per object can be really, really difficult. Sometimes it's documented in MSDN, technical specifications like Leah talked about. Sometimes you actually have to reverse it or just do trial and error. So, you know, there's a little bit of uncharted territory with this stuff. But in general, you have a certain amount of object takeover primitives to where can you modify the owner? Can you modify the rights? Do you have generic all rights? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, shit.
We came prepared, Dave. Oh, okay, whatever. Voluntarily. Good job, Matt. I'm going to keep talking. Go ahead. Enjoy your Smirnoff Ice. So, you know, again, these are a lot of the similar... I'm sorry, this is really funny to me. This happened to me twice last year. Now I get to watch it happen to him. Oh, no, are you chugging? You're worse than I was. Oh, you're going to sip on a warm Smirnoff Ice. Oh. Anyways, you have some of these, like, you know, kind of generic object takeover primitives, you know, writing the owner, writing everything else, like we talked about earlier today. I can't even handle you, man. And then you might also have object-specific takeover primitives. So, you know, Lee, you want to talk about the process components?
Yeah. So, like we said, each object can have its own rights. So, for example, a process has its own set of rights. Like, you could, in order to interact with a process, you may have, when you try and open that process, you can have the create process right, create thread right, or the suspend. Those just define what you can actually do to that object. And really, it's the specific object and its different rights are going to determine the usefulness of those rights you have. So if you don't have a certain right, it may not really matter whether or not you can access the object.
So, oh wait, this actually jumps back into you. Operational weaponization and detection. Now we're going to start, these are the case studies. You want to get through all that background, the slides will be online in the next couple of weeks. Now, these are the really cool things. You're like, here's a whole bunch of weird stuff, now we're going to show you what you can do with it.
So the first kind of case study is the Service Control Manager RPC server. So Service Control Manager is it's a service on Windows that manages all the services on Windows. You interact through that through RPC. RPC is a protocol, and that's defined in that lovely specification there. So you can manipulate services, create new services, stop, start, delete, using this protocol. Some of the interesting rights that you can use specifically for SCM server rights, there's the connect privilege, which you have to have in order to connect to the service control manager on a machine. There's that create service privilege, which if you have that, you can create services on the remote machine. Enumerate service allows you to list the services and view some of their details. One of the interesting things, which I actually didn't know before this, is that by default, unprivileged users on a network can view the security descriptor for the service control manager on other machines. So this is another interesting privilege escalation primitive. If you're on a pen test, just enumerate throughout the entire network the service control manager rights on every single machine.
Oh, actually, do you want to talk through the demo, or do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So here we got sorry.
There's a video.
Yeah.
Is it playing?
You can click it to pause it.
Computers are hard. Okay. All right, so yeah, this is just a demo of the Service Control Manager. So this is demonstrating an admin who's remotely installing this backdoor. So we wrote a script that backdoors the Service Control Manager on our remote host, and this is just executing that. So we're seeing that we changed the decals we added an ACE. Yeah, we should pause it. Added an ACE to the Service Control Manager on the remote host for a specific SID. That SID being any group that you want, any user that you want. So in this case, we did a domain user. So the username is Jason, just some like random person who has no privilege whatsoever. Backdoor the Service Control Manager.
They really are hard.
Yeah, tell me about it. Backdoor the Service Control Manager with this SID, granting the ability to remotely create a service. So once we installed the actual backdoor, you can see that as Jason, we are unable to hit the $, or the admin share of the remote host, right? So we do not have admin access to that host. Now we can see that using sd.exe, we can actually create a backdoor service, and it creates successfully because we have the right via the ACLs on the Service Control Manager. And you can see here that the backdoor service on the other host is existing.
Oh. Nothing too crazy, right? Like, oh, all right, kind of cool, we can create a service. We're going to get more and more complex and crazy as we go on.
Something to kind of highlight from that you can take away is a lot of times we think of gaining access to a machine as limited to just local admin. It's much more than that. Local admin is just a group. It's the security descriptors themselves that actually control access to an object or even a machine in general. So it's when you're starting to think of access to machines, think more about what objects can you access versus just the machine itself.
I'm regretting that Smirnoff Ice right now. All right, so WinRM and WinRS. So WinRM, just Windows remoting. WinRS is the Windows Remote Shell, which is kind of a lesser known kind of caveat or version of that, right? So this is early in the presentation we showed 2 slides of some code that was released in 2014. We didn't have to develop a POC for this because it existed 3 years ago. So what this does is we can add an ACE for a specific domain user, so Jason, the non-privileged user in the domain, to say that this user is allowed to interface or access PowerShell remoting WinRS, so the Windows Remote Shell. So when we backdoor that remotely, that user who obviously has no privilege can access it and run commands on the remote host. So the security descriptor, like Lee said earlier, the security descriptors for the objects are all different and they're enumerated different, right? So for the WinRM and WinRS services, we have to actually call the security descriptor SDDL, which is the string version of the security descriptor of the PowerShell remoting or WinRM/WinRS configuration. So it's not stored as, the service control manager might, or in the registry, for example. So we can do, like get PS session configuration will give us the actual security descriptor for PowerShell remoting. We can use set PS session configuration, after we add the discretionary ACL, which is the decal. So we create an ACE for our backdoored user, add it to the decal to WinRM or WinRS, and then actually apply it with the set PS session configuration commandlet. So like I said, this was weaponized in 2014. Saves me a few hours because I didn't have to actually write. I finished half of it and then went Googling for something, and then this popped up. So I was like, okay. So it just takes a domain SID, and then it literally just adds that SID, or appends the SID to the existing ACL that exists, or ACE that exists. And that gives that user or group the ability to do PowerShell remoting on the remote host or the Windows remote shell to run commands on their remote host without being a local admin or equivalent. So Decom, I'm a huge Decom fanboy. It's close to my heart. So Decom stands for the Distributed Component Object Model. So it's the component object model in Windows has been around since '96. So NT4, it's ancient. It's a forgotten code base. Microsoft expanded that on, and you can access certain components of COM remotely, called Distributed Component Object Model. Decom is secured via remote launch and activation permissions. And so in their registry, there's a byte array that represents a security descriptor of Decom servers, right? So local and remote meaning that locally, if you're on the host, can you instantiate and use this object? Remote being, can you remotely interface with these objects, as yourself? So when you're backdooring these objects, not all objects are interesting. There are a handful of objects that I blogged about recently as far as using them for lateral movement. They have methods within them, like execute shell command or shell execute, that let you run arbitrary commands on the remote host. So backdooring those for a specific user will give you the ability to run arbitrary commands on the remote host, obviously. So Decom's kind of a weird beast, as COM in general is. When Windows evaluates as if a user is actually able to interface with Decom, it checks the machine-wide permissions first. So it says, machine-wide, is this user allowed to access, components of Decom? Typically that's restricted to administrators, backup operators, the remote Decom group, etc. You have to change a user to that. You have to add a decal to that specific, object in the registry, which that path is there. That allows that SID to pass the first checks for Decom. After that, it's application specific, which are those two values there. You have to have specific privileges to set those locally. Remotely, you do not. So when you instantiate an object remotely, Windows says, machine-wide, are you allowed to instantiate this object? Yes or no? Yes, which is the machine-wide permissions. If you pass that, then it goes to the application, and it says, is this Decom application, are you allowed to instantiate and invoke it? Yes or no? So these are the rights. When you are backdooring or changing the different ACLs for Decom objects, these are going to be the values. So you're going to combine the values there of what you want your user to be able to do. So COM rights activate remote is the most fruitful one for us. Right. Yep. And then the demo. So here we're just saying, again, Lab Matt, who's a user who can access your remote host. So we are installing the backdoor remotely. Wrote a function called invoke Decom backdoor. You give it a username, a domain, and then, obviously the remote host. And what it will do is it will add that user or that SID to the machine-wide launch permissions, and then it will backdoor the actual decal for the Decom application you want to use. In this instance, we're using a shell browser window, which is a Decom application that's exposed over for like explorer.exe, so you can interface with the Windows shell remotely.
We'll release all these POC codes within the next week or two.
Yep. So we're using remote registry to take ownership of the key, do all this stuff, adding our malicious or backdoored ACE to the decal on the object. Once we have done that, did it pause? Nope. Okay. So once we've done that as Jason, the unprivileged user who can't do anything, we're just going to demonstrate again that we cannot or we do not have local administrative rights on the remote host, right? So this user is inherently not allowed to administer the remote box. Since we backdoored a specific decom object, we can do invoke decom backdoor trigger, which remotely instantiates this decom object or this shell browser window decom object, which has a method called execute shell command or shell execute, which allows you to run an arbitrary process with parameters. You can see that we did that there. Remotely, the host that we invoked it on, you can see in Procmon or Process Explorer here that we've got a cmd.exe running as JSON, which is that unprivileged user, which was obviously able to execute because we've allowed it via the decom ECLs.
Cool. So again, really subtle stuff, right? To where super dense, whatever else, but you can install these backdoors locally or remotely, and then have unprived users be able to get elevated access for any point in time. And I don't know how many defenders think that they could find a decom backdoor ACL object, but I imagine there's probably not too many of them. The next case is going to be WMI. So WMI more or less rests on top of this like decom RPC stuff that Matt was talking about, and then the WMyClasses also have permissions associated as well. So essentially we're going to do that decom type of RPC approach that I was talking about, and then also add a separate backdoor modification to the WMyClasses. Some of them that might be interesting are like Win32 are the rootsim v2 namespace that allows you to do WMyC process call create, right? Kind of that classic lateral movement. So you can backdoor a system in a way that you can trigger the stuff over WMI without actually having administrator rights. A little bit dense. Well, again, we'll publish these slides online for reference for everybody. But through WMyClasses, you can create these actual ACEs and trustees and everything inherently, so you don't have to wrap a bunch of the Win32 API calls underneath the hood. You can add these malicious ACEs and set the security descriptors with them. I don't know if you want to talk about real quick about some of the WMI namespace permissions.
Yeah, so when you're setting a malicious ACE or adding an ACE entry to the DACL on a namespace, these are kind of the values that you're able to add, right? So the most interesting one obviously is the WMyRemoteAccess. That just gives the user the rights to remotely access that namespace. Once you're able to remotely access that namespace, you're able to, since we backdoored the root sim v2, all of the namespaces below that specific, or all the classes below that specific namespace are accessible to us or accessible to the backdoored user, right? So that involves Win32_process, which has a create method allowing us to start an arbitrary process.
Demo.
Yep, so same thing as earlier, same privileged user who's installing the backdoor normally, validating that we do have administrative access to our target. Then we're calling invoke WMI namespace backdoor, giving it the namespace we want to backdoor, which is the root sim v2, which contains the Win32_process class with the create method. Give it our user, which is the same user lab JSON. You can see here that since WMI or Windows validates to see when you're connecting to WMI, it actually uses decom first to check to see if you're from a machine level, are you able to interface with WMI. So you have to backdoor the machine-wide decom permissions. After doing that, you have to backdoor the actual namespace. And then once you've done that, the user is actually able to remotely invoke that method of the Win32_process class. So this is just installing the backdoor. Certain components of these backdoors use remote registry, which is disabled by default. Since we're installing these as an administrator, you can call set tax service in PowerShell, and what that will do for you is it will set the service, and then you can give it a startup type to manual, and then when you instantiate or when you invoke the remote registry, it automatically starts the service for you. So you can see here that we have added the access mask of 32, which gives us full permissions over the WMI namespace. And then as an unprivileged user, again, just demonstrating that we are not a local admin and we have no administrative rights over that remote host, we can trigger that backdoor. So it's pretty simple. Just invoke WMI method, which is a built-in commandlet in PowerShell. Give it the remote host, give it the class, and then give it the method we want to call. So in this case, we're going to do Win32_process. The class or the method being create, so creating a remote or a process in the remote host, and then we want to just start cmd.exe, right?
Use WMyMic for the same thing as well.
Yeah. So this takes just a second, and what this will do is since this specific user is permitted to call that specific method remotely, without having any additional privilege, we are able to start the remote process given This started with the process ID was 3772. You can see here the IP, and then in Procmon or Process Explorer, we can see here that 3772 is indeed CMD.exe running as that user that we backdoored it.
Only 2 more left. The last one's the coolest.
Yeah.
I promise.
So we're going to kind of push through printers really quick. So when we're talking about printers, there's actually 3 different types of objects that you can interact with that are securable. So there's print servers, you have printer objects themselves, so each individual printer you add on a machine, and then print jobs. I couldn't find anything you could do with print jobs, so I'm not going to really talk about those, but you can find the security descriptors for those other 2 object types in the registry offline. You can also query them online using the printer RPC interface, which is, there's some Win32 APIs that implement that, but they're also specified in those specifications there at the bottom. So if you control access to the print server, if you have full control over a print server, you can do some interesting things. In particular, one of them is control the spooler directory. As you can see here in the print management interface, that is just a path to where print jobs are saved. So a very obvious one is you can change that path to a UNC share that you control as an attacker, and then each time a print job comes in, or each time you want to regain access to a machine, you can have it connect back to your machine, and the machine account hash will come back to you, and you can relay that, assuming you've backdoored something else with the machine account. Another one that you can do, obviously, is add drivers to the remote machine. So if you have admin on the machine and the file share, the print $file share, you can add drivers to the remote machine. So some caveats here. It does have, well, thankfully, it's a user mode. The printer drivers are developed using the user mode driver framework, which doesn't have as strict as signing policies and validation that regular drivers have in Windows. So that is actually really nice, because that means you can get a code signing cert and pretty much just load them up fairly easily. So once you do that, you can get code execution as system on the remote machine. As part of this, I built out some commandlets that are going to help when you're enumerating the different SDDLs. I added some functions to PowerView, one called getNetPrinter, which will get you the security descriptor and SDDL format for a specific printer or print server. As part of that too, there's getNetShare in PowerView. So PowerView has a function called invoke share finder that enumerates all the shares on a machine in the network. And before it just disregarded print $shares. This now enumerates the printers, the print $share, gets all those permissions, and then will return that, and that way you can tell if you have admin rights over the printer as well. All right.
This is the coolest.
So this is, him and I are going to tag team this because this is a royal pain in the butt to figure out. We actually finished the POC at like 1 a.m. last night, so hopefully it actually makes sense. So remote registry, I'm sure a lot of you are pretty familiar with. There's a service that exists that's, like I mentioned earlier, disabled by default. You can remotely enable it as an administrator, and then when you actually interface with it, it starts the service for you. That's the example. You can either do it in .NET. That's the .NET example there. You can also do it via the Win32 API. So our POC uses kind of a mix of both. So when you have remote registry access, when you backdoor that kind of functionality or provider, you're granted a lot of different things. So initially we were like, can we get codecs through the registry? Not in the time that we could, we spent on it. The idea that came to mind was dumping hashes. So most people, when you run hash dump, you pull the local accounts, right? The POC that we've created actually remotely retrieves the machine account hash, which can be used later for silver tickets.
Of note on this is pretty much all other credential dumping tools either have to drop something to disk or log into the machine, and actually you need to load up an agent on the remote machine. This method does not require that.
We can retrieve the machine account hash remotely through just changing a couple of security descriptors.
Pretty neat, right? So the scenario, you backdoor, certain components of a remote host for a specific user, and then any time using that user, you can remotely pull the machine account hash and then use that however you want. So the idea here is to, first you've got to remotely backdoor the remote registry component, right? So that's the path to it. The key is WinReg. So Windows actually pulls, it determines who can access remote registry via the security descriptors that applied to the WinReg registry key. So this is the first time I've seen it, pulling security descriptors from like a registry key itself. No explicit, like binary blobs or byte arrays or etc. So this is kind of interesting. So the first thing, backdoor that. So grant that user or that domain user, remote interfacing with WinReg. And you can do this via the WMI, WMI's registry provider, instead of using, the remote registry itself. So the WMI registry provider does not give you the ability, when you're calculating the boot key to retrieve the machine account hash, which we'll go over kind of the different components here in a minute, you can't do that with WMI. So you have to use remote registry, which is why we're backdooring it to begin with. And obviously it's not started, so you can use set-tac service, or it's not enabled, so you can use set-tac service and then remotely enable it. Once you do that, you have to actually take ownership so that you can apply the ACE to the DACL on the security hive. So this is where the machine account hash actually lives. So we're adding a malicious ACE to the DACL on the security account hive for our backdooring user. So lab Jason, the same user we've been using before. Once you do that, you've got to remotely pull the key classes. The issue with this is that you can only retrieve this information via reg query info key via the Windows API. So you can't do it via WMI. You have to use remote reg. Once you get that, you calculate the boot key. The boot key is calculated. You use that boot key to decrypt the LSA key. With that LSA key, you can then decrypt the machine account hash out of the security hive, which means silver tickets. Who knows about silver tickets? Who's used them?
Sweet.
Yeah, they're awesome.
This demo will hopefully blow your mind.
Yep. So, same thing as before, just demonstrating that we are a privileged user who is installing the backdoor remotely. Invoke reg backdoor, invoke remote reg backdoor. Give it a computer name, the user, the domain. What this does is it does everything that I just explained. Sets the remote service to startup type of manual so that we can use remote reg to pull the information we need from the registry. Backdooring the actual remote registry component, and then that allows us to pull various information or the data we need to calculate the boot key of that host. Once we have all that information, we've scripted it all up. Like Will said, we'll release some of this code, sometime soon. Validating that this user does not have local administrative rights or any sort of privilege to that host. Since we're using a silver ticket, just demonstrating that IP does resolve to dev1.lab.local. Then we call get machine account hash, give it to our remote host, and then we can see that we actually pull the machine account hash out of the remote host. With that information, we can use MEMEMIC. And what this will do is we will create a silver ticket, and that we can apply that silver ticket to our current session, and then that will give us full entire administrative access to that host. So we went from just being able to interface with the registry to having complete control or administrative rights over that remote host without doing anything more than changing a few, entries on some decals for registry stuff.
Indefinitely.
Yeah. So you can see we've done the actual MEMEMIC command. We can see that we are now able to dir $C of that remote host.
So, cool. Awesome. Yeah. So we have about 1 minute left. SACLs, the other component of ACLs that we talked about, these aren't utilized as much as they should be. We're going to start doing some actual defensive research in the next couple of months to actually give guidance to everybody in how to tune SACLs in a way to prevent or at least detect all the ACL-based backdoors that we've been talking about from the Active Directory and the host-based side. Defensive enumeration, again, part of the thing with this talk, along with the research we've been doing recently, is you can't defend against what you are not aware of, right? So we want to build additional tooling for enumeration, try to bring attention to these different components, because we fully believe that adversaries have very likely done this before. But if you're not even aware of what the attack class is, then you don't know how to find it, much less detect it, prevent it, and mitigate against it. So I don't know if you want to hit the takeaways.
Yeah, so some of the takeaways, the host control graph is much bigger than just having local admin to a machine. So when you think of Bloodhound and that whole pathway to domain admin, well, it's much more than just you have local admin. It's do you have control over Service Control Manager? Do you have control over the remote reg? Do you have control over WMy? So, and then part of this, one of the things we really learned about was what is the real attack surface of Windows? There's so many different services and different RPC servers that we have either forgotten about or we're just unaware of or are undocumented that I'm really excited to start digging into. There's also several securable objects that we haven't even touched on yet. So there's a lot of research left to do.
Then we have our obligatory Microsoft troll slide to where plenty of these remote protocols allow any domain authenticated user to actually perform basic enumeration. We don't know why these are put in place, so.
Yeah, it's like with SAMR, for example, which lets you remotely query the local administrators group on machines. They locked that down in Windows 10, but most of these other RPC protocols that could be leveraged aren't locked down. So I ask myself, why aren't those locked down? But SAMR is. They're just as useful.
Anyways, I think we're out of time now. We know that was pretty much a fire hose. If anyone wants to talk more